My name's Alex. I'm the chair of the Council of Christians and Jews, and welcome to this event, pilgrimage pilgrimage travel during the pandemic. Let's get it right. We do these kind of sessions fairly regularly. This is our first one on a Thursday evening, so thank you those who are here for being here this evening. I'll introduce our guests in a minute, but let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Myself and our guests are all in Melbourne, so we're on the land of the Kulin Nations. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge that the land has never been ceded and that we're on their land. So with that, land will be, I'm sure, a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's begin by introducing our two guests. Many of you will know them. Both of them are on our CCJ executive. So firstly, let's introduce Colleen O'Reilly, or should I say correctly, the Reverend Canon Dr. Colleen O'Reilly AM, an Anglican priest in Melbourne, semi-retired, and currently working as a locum vicar in various parishes around Melbourne, having served in a number of communities in Melbourne and in Sydney. And our other guest, who's also on our CCJ executive, is Mark Walsh, who describes himself as an educator, a facilitator, an accompanier, a pilgrim. He works at our Sisters of Our Lady of Sion as formation leader for the Australian region, and also curates a page called A Pilgrim's Path. So with that, I'm actually going to turn over to Mark first, given that he curates that page, and ask the first question before we get into the actual travel, is what does pilgrimage, or what does a pilgrim mean to you? And what if you curate this page in particular, so you might have insight, but just in general, what does pilgrimage mean to you, and how do you describe a pilgrim?
Thanks, Alex. I think a pilgrim is many things. I think they're a seeker. I think to go on pilgrimage is to go on a very deliberate journey, to be very present to what you're doing, to have an intent behind that and an openness to what will transpire. There are a few other elements that I might talk about in the next little bit of the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we can all be pilgrims, and it's a matter of paying attention to the sacred that is in the world. And for some pilgrims, that involves journeying to a place on foot. For others, it involves going to a place to visit sacred sites.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And Colleen, by way of introduction, that first question, what is pilgrimage and how do you describe a pilgrim?
Yeah, it's very interesting how pilgrimage has re-emerged in the modern world, but certainly amongst Western people, as a purposeful journey. So I always think of pilgrimage as a journey with a purpose, which is inner as well as outer. I mean, we often go to visit family or friends or to sightsee, but a pilgrimage has that dimension of wanting to be reflective and purposeful about the place that we're going to. And it's really interesting because I think every religious tradition has a form of pilgrimage in some way or other. And amongst Christians, it kind of fell into disuse, really. And it's only been in the last 50 years or so that it's really had a resurgence amongst people and become something that we increasingly do with modern travel, which makes it possible, of course.
Right. So I'd say in Judaism, it's not quite the same kind of thing. But there are the three festivals known as the Pilgrim festivals, which was the time when Jews from around Israel generally, or around the Middle East area, would journey to Jerusalem. At the moment, as you say, the word is used in a different context. We often say we might be going to, when we go to Israel, we might say we're going on pilgrimage, but really it's not quite the same thing. But maybe for you it is. So actually, maybe that as a segue, let's go to Colleen. So Colleen, you start your journey recently, maybe a month or so ago, was to Israel. So I think I'm going to share your slides, and then you can tell us about some of your travels.
Good, thank you. This was my fourth trip to Israel, but the first time that my husband, who's the person with the mask around his neck, had been, and I finally managed to get him there. I only know one person who lives in Jerusalem, and I happened to run into them at St. George's Cathedral when we went to worship there on Sunday morning. So that's Bashara Khoury, who is a guide, and I've made 2 trips with Bashara in the past. So it was a great joy to quite unexpectedly meet him in the cathedral. And that's part of pilgrimage, isn't it? The unexpected, the surprises, the things that you don't plan that happen. And this was also a journey like Mark's that was put off because of the pandemic. We were planning to go in 2020 with a group of friends, and it was put off in 21. And then finally we went in the second half of June this year. It was wonderfully warm. It was just a delight to get away from Melbourne's cold and enjoy the sunshine that you can see there that we were enjoying in the courtyard of St. George's Cathedral. This was one of the highlights of our trip. I went with a group of people and friends of Trinity College Theological School, and the man in the wet t-shirt isn't trying to be Mr. Darcy. He has just been baptized in the River Jordan. He had decided to be baptized, and then knowing he was coming on this trip, decided that he would be baptized in Israel at the site that is traditionally attributed as the site where Jesus was baptized. Maybe it may be a site where the Israelites crossed into the Promised Land when they crossed the River Jordan. It certainly has symbolic significance. And the Dean of Theology, Dr. Bob Derenbacher, is there as the priest who baptized him. And he came up out of the water, the newest Christian probably for about 3 or 4 seconds, because there's always somebody being baptized somewhere. But that was very special for him. This is Ein Gedi. Now, I had never been to Ein Gedi before. Traditionally said to be where Saul hid in the cave, and David came across him and had the opportunity to kill Saul, but did not, because Saul was the Lord's anointed. Instead, he cut a piece of from his clothing and was able to show Saul that he spared him. This was a beautiful sight. Now, I'm sure there are people watching who know it, but it was new to me. Down near Masada, and it's in a national park. The day we went was very hot, and of course down in the south is very hot in the summer. And coming across a spot like this, particularly when you lived in the land and you didn't have an air-conditioned bus to get there, must have been just miraculous. And look how beautifully clear the water is. The spring was obviously feeding that little pool. There were, in fact, people swimming in it when we went. I didn't photograph them, but it was just a delight to be in this area, which was the scene of a story so far back in our shared history, and still such a beautiful place to be. I wish we'd had time to go swimming in the beautiful clear water as well. Now, this really was a highlight. That's not the boat we were in, but I took that photo from the boat, a very similar boat, on the Sea of Galilee. People might well recognize the Sea of Galilee there. And it's been my experience every time I've been to Galilee that we get onto one of these flat bottom boats, go out onto the lake, they turn the engines off, and you just have the experience of being on the lake and getting a sense of what it might have been like in the past to have lived around that beautiful water. But the particular day that we went on the boat this trip was the Sunday when, in the Christian lectionary, we were reading the gospel of a story where Jesus had crossed to the Gentile side of the lake and encountered a man who was out of his mind and been chained up in a cemetery. And he was so strong and so demented that he could break the chains and escape. So the people were very afraid of him, and he was notorious in the area. But he recognized who Jesus was. He asked for healing. Jesus healed him, and he was clothed and in his right mind at the end of the story. But what was remarkable was reading that. I was invited to read that gospel during our worship. And I'm reading the story and I look up and I think, this happened just over there on that shore. And that's one of the joys of pilgrimage, that sense of, well, it might not be the exact spot, and that doesn't matter, but you're in the area, you're seeing the geography, you're getting a feel for the weather, and it brings the scriptures, I think it brings the scriptures to life in a whole new way that nothing else quite does. And I also went for a swim in the Sea of Galilee, the beautiful, lovely hot weather. So one afternoon after sightseeing, I came back and I had a swim. And then I decided to stand for a little while just on the shore, and little fish came and nibbled at my feet. And Alex and Mark might recall that I told you this story when we had a meeting of the executive, and my Jewish friend said, yes, well, that's probably why Jesus walked. Some people will recognize this model from the Museum of Israel. I absolutely love this model every time I see it, because it's so helpful in giving us a sense of what the city of Jerusalem was like during the Second Temple period. We're looking there at the Antonia Fortress, which is just slightly left of center, and then right at the edge is the temple. It's a huge model. You walk around it, as you can see the scale from people in the background, but it really does bring Jerusalem to new life and give a sense of the scale of the city, the size of the temple and how it dominated the city. And then the Antonia Fortress, the occupying Romans were there, and the fortress has towers so that the Romans could see what was going on in the temple courtyard. So that sense of living under occupation as Jewish people were doing at the time of Jesus, and the scale of the city, the houses of the ordinary people, the houses of the elite, the pools for ritual washing, the pools for bathing the animals who would be sacrificed in the temple. It's all there, and it's just absolutely fascinating. I'm always pleased when I go back and have a chance to take in more detail from that model that's been built. I think in the 50s, I think it was built. Oh, this is a very unflattering photo of my husband and I to show that we really were in Jerusalem together. You can see that looking across to the Temple Mount there, that's from on the Mount of Olives. So there we are, proof that we were there and we had a wonderful time.
So thank you very much for that. Just before I move on to Mark, so both of you spoke about pilgrimage as going to a place of spiritual. Obviously, Israel fulfills that category. But Mark also mentioned walking. Was that part of your pilgrimage experience as well, or is that pilgrimage for you?
We did a lot of walking when we got to places, but to get to places, we traveled by bus. So I can't claim any of the virtue that Mark is probably able to talk about.
So on that note, let's turn to Mark. So Mark, as we said as was on the original flyer, Mark started the Camino journey 2 years ago, and then something called COVID got in the way, and he completed it about a month ago as well. So I'll turn over to you, Mark, and you can tell us about your journey and what it meant to you.
I think one of the wonderful things about walking a pilgrimage, and particularly even walking in somewhere like the Holy Land in Israel and Palestine and Jordan, those other biblical sites, is that you see the place in a very different way. And I guess the pilgrimage that I walked most recently was Camino de Santiago. And if you look at this map, you'll see that it's almost like a series of veins all across Europe and England. And there are many roads that lead to Santiago, the most famous of which is the Camino Frances, which was in the movie The Way, and that travels just along here. But the journey I started a couple of years ago, I started just outside of Lisbon, which is just off the map, and made it to Porto, thinking I'd be back maybe the next summer or with members of my family the next year to walk from Porto to Santiago. And that didn't happen, but I did manage to get away in June to walk that part of the journey. And hopefully next year we'll be walking that with members of my family. So I loved it, Colleen, that you mentioned that pilgrimage is a journey of purpose that has an inner and an outer aspect. So I'm going to talk really briefly to 4 points. And each of these has an inner and an outer aspect that comes to life through the journey of pilgrimage. The first one is, I guess, in walking a Camino, you have the choice to carry everything in a pack upon your back, which means that you are responsible for that weight. You have to bear that. And if you can't bear it, you have to find alternate means to get it from point A to point B. And there are lots of ways that you can do that because not everyone is able to carry their own pack. But for me, most of the time I've carried my own pack, and having that limited amount of weight has really forced me to look at the idea of simplicity. And one of the things I regularly do when I come back from walking a Camino is start to clean out my wardrobe, because I realise that I have much more than I need, especially because I've lived out of a pack for the last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, depending on the length of that Camino. In addition to that, one of the other aspects of simplicity that is a physical aspect on the Camino, an outer part of the journey, is that sense that you follow arrows. And there are signs all along the way to give you direction. And when those signs fail, there are also Camino apps that will pinpoint where you are. But I guess the inner part of that journey of having those signs is sometimes learning to trust your own gut feeling. When I began the Camino de Costa, which walks along the coast of Portugal up to Santiago, the de Costa doesn't actually start on the coast. It goes through the middle of town before it eventually gets to the coast. And I knew that if I walked down to the river Douro, I could then follow that to the sea and walk up. But I was following the app and I was following the arrows, and neither of them were taking me where I needed to go. So in the end, I guess I had to follow my own instinct and my own sense of purpose, and I managed to find the river and managed to make my way down to the sea. And then after that, you simply turn right, and as long as the sea's on your left, you're going in the correct direction. I guess a further element of simplicity is that quite often we're sharing space with other people. Now, this was on my first part of this Camino when I walked in the middle of winter and there were no other pilgrims. I had this whole dormitory to myself. But one of the options you do have is staying in simple shared accommodation. I'm no martyr. That was one of only several times where I did that. I'm really enjoy having my own room and my own space and allowing my bag to just explode all over the place once I arrive in places. One of the beautiful things about the Camino Portugués, or the route of the Portuguese, is that it's actually 2 Caminos. And along the way you'll see yellow arrows, which are pointing to Santiago, and you'll see blue arrows, which are pointing to Fatima. And so you can actually walk this pilgrimage in either direction. And the more authentic pilgrimage, I guess, for Portuguese people is the one from many of the cities within Portugal to Fatima. And interestingly, the only other pilgrim I met on that very first winter Camino on the Portuguese was a Portuguese gentleman who was walking in the opposite direction to me, to Fatima. And we enjoyed a little bit of conversation before we each went on our separate ways. Me to walk the path that he'd just come on, and he to walk the path that I'd just left. Which brings me, I guess, to the second point, which is presence. I was really tempted to share a lot of my really beautiful Camino pictures, but I thought I'd share this one, which is one of my favourite Camino pictures. There are a lot of Instagrammable moments on the Caminos de Santiago, and I've shared a lot of those on my Facebook page, A Pilgrim's Path. But this one means a lot to me because it reminds me that when we're walking a Camino through Spain or Portugal or France or any of those routes that lead to Santiago, we're walking through people's lives. And sometimes those lives are messy. They involve garbage, they involve shops, they involve factories and industrial areas that sometimes as walkers we don't find as appealing. But what they do reveal to us is that we are guests in another place. And one of my favorite journeys when I was living in Jerusalem is when we would come back from the Galilee via the route that went past IKEA. And I would remember that there is a whole other life that goes on in Israel beyond um, the business of pilgrimage and religion. So that was always a really important moment for me, to be reminded to be present to where I am and to be present to the people I'm with and in whose land I am a guest, and to be present to the land itself, because it really is remarkably beautiful. And this is a special part of the Camino Portugués called the spiritual variant. And this is a route within that called the route of stone and water. And it's about a 7-kilometre route down the side of a mountain along a river, 2 rivers. And it's a really beautiful, incredible path. I think I'd walked the first 3 kilometres and I felt like I'd walked for a day, because I think I was stopping so often to take pictures, but I was just so overwhelmed with the beauty, so immersed in the beauty. Another incredible scene of beauty, this bridge, which I guess dates back to about the 18th century, but is built on Roman foundations. So almost 2,000 years old, in Ponte Sampaio. So we get to hospitality now, and this is a beautiful little tent albergue. People can stay there for free, and they're asked to enter in peace, choose their tent, to sleep in peace, and to go in peace. The gentleman I met that morning had stayed here. I think it was just a little bit too basic for my tastes. But hospitality is offered in many, many different ways. And I guess it's part of that that element of the Camino. And even as guests, we offer hospitalities to locals by trying to speak in the local language, by being courteous, by being kind, and by being accepting of customs which we may or may not agree with. And then finally, the last aspect I want to talk about is communitas. This idea that we walk a Camino, I'm just in the middle of Lindsay's head there, we walk a Camino with others, locals and guests, and that coming together around a table often to break bread, to share wine, to share a meal, within a Christian sense, that's really quite Eucharistic. But it's there, and it's a beautiful element. Within a Jewish sense, I guess, I sense you've got that sense of the blessings I remember before meals of bread and of wine, and the honouring of that space. And so I guess that sense of communitas, here we see it in a really physical way. But I know when I come back from a Camino, I am much more conscious of being hospitable, of building community, and of doing all of those things. So Alex, I think that's probably enough from me and a little bit of my recent Camino.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. That was beautiful. And if I can, I want to relate something of myself as well, in that I very much related to what you said about presence and simplicity. In a Jewish sense, from my perspective, I relate to that from the perspective of the Sabbath. That's when you turn off, and when you need to be present in the moment, and you need to basically live the simple life for a day or so, without technology, without all the rest of it. So I related to that in a sense. But actually, there's also a deeper thing, which is, for anyone who may know, in Judaism, there's a concept called Shemitah, which is the 7th year, which is basically like the Sabbath, but it's for the land, where the land lies fallow for a year. And so you need to firstly prepare for that year, and secondly also live that year in a different way. But a lot of that is, old style traditions that maybe don't apply anymore. I don't know how people practice the Shemitah these days. What I do know is that I recently went to a lecture, to someone who was speaking about this concept of Shemitah, of the 7th of lying fallow, and he talked about, personally, every year it comes to Shemitah, he does something. This year, by the way, is the Shemitah year, so it will finish in Rosh Hashanah in a few months. but every year it comes to the Shemitah, he does something that he usually doesn't do. And like you said, you came back and you stopped buying clothes, or didn't have, you got rid of your wardrobe or whatever it was. So he said that, like, for example, every time it comes to Shemitah, he either, doesn't drink for a year, or doesn't buy books for a year, or doesn't, whatever it is, he finds something that's personal to him that he does a lot of all the time. And then for that year, he doesn't do that because he's present, because he's trying to be simple, because this year, even without travel, still means something to him. And so I very much related what you said about that. So thank you very much for sharing that. Colleen, did you have anything to add on that?
I wanted to add to that an experience I had a couple of pilgrimage trips ago, where we flew into Amman and then into Tel Aviv, and our luggage stayed in Jordan. So we got to Jerusalem with only just what we'd taken into the cabin of the plane, and Shabbat was coming, so we thought, well, it's going to be at least a couple of days, and I think it was 3 or 4 days before the luggage finally made it through. It was a good experience, because when we got to St. George's College, the dean's wife said, well, actually, we have bags of clothing here, which we've gathered, which are going to the Palestinian refugee camps, and you're very welcome to help yourselves. And that was a really good experience for Western people with overpacked wardrobes, and I'd have to put my hand up to that, to actually have to rummage around, find something to wear from other people's discards. It was a taste of what it's like to be a refugee, or to be seeking asylum, or to be poor, and it was totally unexpected, and that was just a very a good experience of pilgrimage, in the sense that, again, an unexpected event, perhaps not as delightful as meeting the only person you know in Jerusalem, but it was a good experience. It brought us up short against that the reality that we were pilgrims in another land.
Yeah,
so
well, I mean, I
in need of hospitality.
I tend to find that every time I travel, I have some kind of experience like that, where whether it's, you come back feeling slightly different, refreshed in a different way, you see things in a different way, and whether it does or doesn't affect your lifestyle, or whether you remove some of the clothes in your wardrobe or whatever it is, but either way, I tend to always feel that. So yes, I think I relate to them. And I think anyone who's traveled, especially traveled with purpose, as we're talking about, I think relates very much to that. But I wanted to touch on something you said, Colleen. Maybe we'll go to you first on this one, although I think this will apply to both of you. Is obviously this wasn't your first trip. It may have been your husband's first trip, but it wasn't. It was your 4th trip, I think you said, to Israel. So I think part of pilgrimage, certainly for me as well, is going back to the same places. So I wanted to ask you what it means to you to go back to the same places, and why you choose to go back to the same place. There's many other countries in the world where you could have gone, or where you could have even experienced spirituality or presence or other things that you both spoke about. So talk to us why you went back to the same place again.
What I've experienced in going to Israel is that it gives me, well, it brings the stories to life. One of our groups said this time it's like reading the scriptures in 3D. So, and every time there's an opportunity to learn more, to understand more of the cultural background, the customs, understand more of why stories are told the way they are, or why a certain wisdom how that might have arisen out of historical or cultural experience. Plus that seeing the geography and getting a sense of, you get a sense of how dry and hot and dusty desert is, and how beautiful the Galilee is, and why that was why that was lovely, considered a lovely space to be, the beautiful Galilee. And of course, Jesus spent most of his time in the Galilee, and most of his ministry in the countryside. It's also to see how it's also an experience, as Mark was saying, of the country as it is now. And if people have ever said to me, is it safe to go to Israel? I say, is it safe? It's a modern country. It's a first world country. You're safer there than most places. And that's that contrast between wanting to be there to learn about the ancient history and the customs of the past, some of which persist, some of which have gone, and yet being there in a first world country where, you know, if you had a heart attack, you'd have the best medical care available, is just fascinating. It's just a fascinating part of the world.
Mm. Well, I agree with you because I've been to Israel 5 times, so I'm not disagreeing with you in any way.
Yeah.
And on your last point, I think Israel just this week opened their biggest trauma hospital ever. So you're even in better hands than you were before. So absolutely, you're right on that.
The other aspect of that, of course, is I say to people, look, hospitality is a really, really high value. And as a guest, as a sojourner, you will receive that hospitality of which the scriptures speak, the hospitality accorded the stranger, and you will be looked after, and you won't be allowed near anything that might be happening that might be even slightly dangerous.
Right, absolutely. And Mark, the same question would apply to you. I know you've done different elements of the Camino, but talk to us why you're so interested in going back to the Camino. And I think you said you're going back next year with your family. Why do you want to go back to the same kind of place, even in different parts?
It's one of those questions that I think there's a number of people on here who are drawn back again and again to that Camino. I think Colleen mentioned a little bit of that sense of a deepening of that experience. However, I do believe that you should always engage in these experiences if it is the last and only time you're doing them, because you never know. And I think the last few years has taught us that, in particular, that all the plans we make can be worth nothing. But I think the thing that draws me back to the Camino is that last point that I spoke about before, and it's communitas, a sense of community. And you can imagine the Camino as a river of pilgrims moving through Spain or Portugal with the local people, with the hosts. Many of the pilgrims are local people. I think the vast majority of people who walk the Caminos to Santiago are Spanish and Portuguese and other Europeans. And I guess it's that beautiful image of a whole lot of people with the same purpose, walking in the same direction. And I think that really allows you to enter more deeply into that space. So for me, Santiago is not as important anymore, except that I've got good friends who are there. For me, it's the journey that's the most important thing. It's very different to when I go to Jerusalem or to any of the holy sites over there. I'm very much instead going to a particular place, and my walking there might be important, but it allows me to deepen that experience. But I think the thing that draws me back to the Camino is that common sense of purpose, that river of pilgrims moving across the land and moving through the land and allowing the land to move through them.
Well, thank you very much for that. I've got a few more questions, but I see there's already some questions in the chat. If anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat. And if we have time in a minute, we'll come back to them. But firstly, Mark, while we're with you, let's continue with you. And this session was titled Pandemic Travel, or Travel During the Pandemic. So tell us, given that you've done this before as well, how was this time different? And what have you learned from traveling during these times?
I think it was different in that there was a whole lot of extra paperwork that I had to do to get into Spain. In fact, that was probably the least bit. The hardest bit was trying to get back into Australia, spending 45 minutes filling out a form that I wouldn't have had to have filled out if I'd come back home 3 days later. So that's really one of the big changes that affected pilgrimage. Yeah, there was a sense of David, and it's very much your story too, isn't it, of pilgrimage interrupted. This desire to go that's being thwarted by the fact that in solidarity with people around the world, we don't move into their spaces and they're dealing with all of these things. I think one of the good things, and something I might even do, is I didn't mind wearing a mask on the plane. I think I've often picked up a bit of a cold and a bug and things like that on the planes. They kept telling us that the air was being purified with the wings of 1,000 doves every 35 seconds and that we were walking and, but I have picked up colds and everything before. And I guess wearing a mask is something that really, for me, was was that I didn't encounter COVID when I was there, but I know of other people who were affected by it on their journeys. I was just really lucky, I guess.
Mm. So I was away around the same time as you, not on a pilgrimage, but just in Europe as well. And I also had to fill in that form that 3 days later I wouldn't have had to fill in. And I agree with you about masks on the plane. I had no issue with wearing a mask on the plane, and I didn't get sick at all, even though some people at the conference that I was at did get sick from COVID or other things. So I completely agree with you. And Colleen, what was it like for you to travel this time, particularly during the pandemic and in general? How was it different to your previous experiences, especially in Israel?
Well, I had the same frustrations that Mark had with filling in forms. And in fact, I had to fill in a form to get into Israel. I had to do it for my husband too, who's even less adept at these things than I am. And so I saw my name in Hebrew. And getting back into the country, that was almost a nightmare. I think everybody in our group had trouble filling in the form that was needed to come back into Australia. And I kept thinking, why don't they just give us that card that you always get on the plane? Just give us the card, let us do that. But we had to do that as well. And as it happened, Mark and I both arrived back on the same evening, although we didn't know it. And because our plane was on time, but the luggage took forever to come off, and our driver was waiting for us and holding up a sign with my name, which is how Mark knew I was coming through. But it got held up for so long that the driver gave up and went home. And of course, on the bus, we wore masks. On the bus, we distanced ourselves socially whenever we were indoors, anywhere. But fortunately, no one that I was aware of on the trip caught COVID, although I believe a couple of people caught it on the plane, from the plane on the way back.
Yeah, so as I said, I had similar experience. We wore masks on buses and on travel, but otherwise we were pretty much left to ourselves. And I don't think anyone, maybe one person in our group, I think, did get COVID, but generally we were all COVID safe as well. David Schutz, I think you had a question, or at least a comment, that you'd like to ask that now.
It was just a question, and I think that Mark's already answered it, that when you do a pilgrimage in stages, which has interruptions along the way, and I understand that the Europeans do the Camino like that quite often. We as Australians, we will take off our 8 weeks and go and do it in one lot, but the Europeans do it in their holidays. They've got 7 days, so they'll do 7 days and they'll go back and they'll come back again. And this and that sort of inspired me for how we could do our 1,250 kilometer trip from here to St. Mary's Tomb over a period of time. It didn't have to be done in one lot, but it does affect you and your daily life such that you're a pilgrim all the time during that whole period, even when you're back home waiting to put on the backpack and pick up the stocks again and get going.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a great observation. And I guess I actually at one point was calling the Camino, was on my Camino Interrupted, because there was a big period of distance between beginning it and ending it. And I ended one and started the other in Porto. But in between, I became a member of a group called Pilgrimage in Place, which was started by Annie O'Neill, who's a pilgrim and producer of an amazing documentary on the Camino called 6 Ways to Santiago, and I highly recommend that. As probably the best thing I've seen on the Camino de Santiago. And we grappled for 2 years, often meeting every week, for them on a Saturday, but for me on a Sunday morning, and it became a little bit of my Eucharistic experience where we gathered together and we spoke about where we were in our lives and bringing what we'd learnt as pilgrims on the Caminos de Santiago to our lives, bringing them into the way we looked at things, the way we were present to one another and the way we were present to the world. And I think it's a wonderful gift to break up a Camino over those bits. Going all the way from Australia, it's a long way to go to do it in bits and pieces. But I met a woman on my first Camino at the very beginning, traditional beginning of the modern Camino Frances in St. John Peter Port, and I said, how long have you been walking? She said, I've been walking for the last, from my home in Frankfurt for the last 7 years, and I plan to reach Santiago in 5 years' time. Now that's a huge commitment, but imagine the gift that that can bring to your life if you can bring that pilgrim mind and that pilgrim presence to it.
Well, actually, that leads me on to my next question, which maybe, Mark, you can go first, since that's exactly what we're talking about, which is, what would be, do you intend to do another leg of the Camino? And if not, what would be the next? Do you have another pilgrimage in mind, or what would be next on this journey of being a lifelong pilgrim?
Thanks, Alex. And that idea of being a lifelong pilgrim, it really, I think David commented briefly before about that tension between the destination and the journey. They're both so integral and important to one another. I'm going to walk part of the journey that I walked this year from the border of Portugal and Spain, Camino, to Santiago with my brothers and a number of their children. And I also hope to take a group to Israel and Palestine one Christmas coming up, offering the little bonus of Christmas in Bethlehem before beginning a pilgrimage in the footsteps of Jesus, going to the Galilee, coming back through the Samaria into Judea and Jerusalem. So that's my next one, and hopefully those things will happen over the next couple of years.
And Colleen, the same question to you, but just before we get there, there's one of the Jewish organizations based in Australia is currently planning a walking tour of Israel, maybe very much in line with the kind of things you're talking about, Mark. So Colleen, what would be next on your list, and do you see yourself back in Israel again sometime?
Oh yes, I do. I'm already just started some correspondence with a guide on the ground there that I'm hoping will organise a tour next year, possibly September next year, and when it's not too hot. And he's quite happy to take quite a small group, so I'm just going to, I think, gather a group of friends and offer that experience to people who haven't had it yet. And who knows, maybe that won't be the last time I go. But I think the comment about being in a place and treating it as if that's the only time you're going to be there is very interesting, because that also corresponds with that sense of life as pilgrimage, that our lives are themselves a pilgrimage, and that's a very common metaphor in spirituality, and that's a helpful way to think about our lives as well, which also puts into perspective that, you know, there's no wrong turnings, no mistakes, just the things that happen, and you journey through them and beyond them, and are changed by them.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree, and I think we're just to finish off, we are possibly running a bit early, but that's okay. I don't mind finishing off. I don't think unless anyone has any burning questions or last points, but just to finish off. David, you have another question?
Just following on from both what Mark and Colleen have said, the way, because you ask yourself when you get back from such an event, how has it changed me? How am I putting this into action? And I think one of the simplest things I learned from the experience, especially if you're doing a walking pilgrimage like David was, like Mark was, so you've got a specific thing you have to do in any given day, and that is you get up and you have to get to that other place. And every day is a little pilgrimage in itself, because you have a destination. And then when you come back, to think of your every day as, I have one job to do today, not many tiny little jobs all over the place, but I have one focus. And if I make it to there, then this day has been, I've done what I was called to do this day.
Well, actually, Albert, I'll come back to you, Albert's question, in a second, but that's what I was actually going to say follows on exactly from that, which is people come, when I've just been away as well, and I was at a conference where we did a lot of walking and a lot of thinking and a lot of, you know, just mental walking as opposed to necessarily physical walking. But people, you come back, and yes, I've been away, and people say, I'm jealous you were away, but they say, oh, I'm jealous you went on holiday. Well, it wasn't necessarily a holiday. you know, as David said, every day I had something to do. Every day was a busy day. Every day there was a journey. Every day there was a destination. And so I'm guessing for pilgrimage in particular, you definitely would feel very much like that. And as much as you've been away, it probably wasn't exactly, you know, a relaxing holiday on a beach.
No.
Yeah,
no, not at all.
A trip is never a holiday in that sense.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's a classic in pilgrimage literature, the tension between being a pilgrim and being a tourist.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not well defined, but it's a classic.
Right. Well, as a pilgrim, you're also a tourist, obviously. Mark.
I think we're all a little bit of both.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Just listening to Mark earlier, the thing that one of the things that I bring back from it is that it informs my preaching. And I'm always trying, so I'm able to give people historical background, a sense of the geography of a place, and the customs that lie behind a story, which on the surface might seem quite straightforward, but in fact, when you delve into it and understand what's behind it, is much richer. So I'm always trying to use my knowledge and experience to, again, to bring the scriptures to life for people.
Very much so. Albert.
Yes, thank you, Alex. This is a comment more than a question, but Mark, I'm very interested in your pilgrimage through Portugal. I am a Sephardic Jew on both sides of my family. Yeah, like a lot of Sephardim, we came from Spain, and after the expulsion because of the Inquisition, we went to Portugal, and then of course the Sephardim, we were expelled from Portugal 5 years later. My own family went from Portugal to the Netherlands, and the relationship between the Netherlands and Spain and Portugal, as you probably know, Mark, very interesting, because prior to the 7 Years' War, the Netherlands was a Spanish colony, but because it had become Protestant, there was great disagreement religiously between the two places. And on the old saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend, Jews were welcomed into the Netherlands. And then when Oliver Cromwell, in one of the very few good things he did, opened the country to, or reopened the country to Jews in the 1660s, my family went to England at that time. So that's a bit of my background, and I'd be interested in any comments you've got, particularly Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Albert. You point out a really interesting and important thing, is that I guess when we're on pilgrimage, we're in the present, but the past is also present to us.
Yes.
And there are often stories that we're not aware of. I mean, particularly when you're in Spain and particularly Portugal, you're faced with much of the wealth and many of the monuments and many of the things that are held up in art and sculpture are the results of colonization and the tragedy that accompanied that, as well as parts of the world were plundered for you know. So I guess it's that walking on many levels in the Holy Land. It's really interesting because you can often go down and visit those levels, and it's one of the beautiful things about being in somewhere like Jerusalem. But there are so many levels that we're traveling in amongst, and that's why I think it's always really a sign of hospitality to do some research on the place that you're walking through and to pay attention to some of the signs and ask stories about them.
Absolutely. And maybe as final thoughts, Colleen, anything to add on that?
Just listening to that sense of the past is with us as we walk. Well, that's certainly true in the places that we've been talking about. But it's interesting, I was just suddenly thought, now there are things like the Lara Pinta Trail that people can walk. And it seems to be that we're now developing these secular pilgrimages in Australia where people can begin to appreciate the culture that's been here for so long and experience something of the landscape of Australia and learn some of the customs. So I wonder if that isn't in fact a sort of modern, it's dressed up as tourism, but it may in fact turn out to be for people, perhaps without them even realizing it, a kind of pilgrimage.
Right. I mean, it might be secular, but it's certainly sacred. So I would say it probably is. Some would definitely call it a pilgrimage for sure. And as David points out, secular pilgrimage really is a real live thing. So thank you very much to both of you. As I mentioned at the beginning, both Colleen and Mark are on our executive, and I think our executive is all the richer for having them with us, especially with their knowledge of the past that they bring to the present. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Just before we go, I'm going to share one last screen. For those who can see this is our next event coming up. This is our AGM on the 28th of August, where our Shirley Sadari oration will be given by Vivian Nguyen, who's the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission. This will be, for those who are on our mailing list, you'll receive this next week. And so watch out for that and book along. So thank you again for coming. Thank you everyone for your insights, for your questions, for your comments. Thank you again, Colleen and Mark, and all the best and have a great night.
Thank you.